everybody. Super excited to be here. Like Pata said, last year I was here as an attendee, and the company I was working for was sponsoring. It was super fun to get to connect with everybody and network. Today, my talk is a little different than the other talks you've heard so far. I'm hoping to encourage at least one person in this audience to not just React on the web, but to consider mobilizing with React Native. So who am I outside of work? These lovely people I call my family, and I like to say I'm running my own personal Lyft by Mom chauffeur service. My daughter on the bottom doesn't like when I text her that, but I think it's funny. My oldest daughter has started her software development career in the Air Force, so I'm super proud. And my son plays all the sports. So why are we here? What I'm hoping that you will take away from this presentation is that you can take your current React web development skills, honestly, any JavaScript, TypeScript skills, and become a mobile developer with React Native. So in this talk, we're going to talk about how you can take those current skills and apply them to mobile development. Talk about the similarities, the setup that's required, how builds, deploys, etc. are different, and some of the gotchas. How do you debug and work through some of that? So from there, I'm hoping you'll mobilize and have some fun with those new skills. So this is going to be super simplified, right? 20 some minutes is not enough to really get into all of the complexities. However, when we get into the similarities, we have React at the core. You have use state, use effect, all the things that you're used to. You have JSX and HTML if you really wanted to. That's how you're creating your components. The DOM elements get a little bit different because instead of, say, divs, you have views or different types of containers. But just like any React web app, we have some, of the common tools. It's JavaScript or TypeScript. TypeScript is now the default in React Native 0.71. And for those that aren't familiar with how long React Native has been around, it's still not a 1.0, but I've been doing React Native since 0.52, I think, for 5 years. So I think it's here to stay. We have local storage, but in React Native, we call that async storage. And we have CSS, sort of-ish, and I'll get into that a little bit more. And in reality, you can use other JavaScript libraries that you're used to, that you would typically want to use in a web development environment. But what about the differences? So we have navigation, works a little different. Styling. So like I said, there's CSS, sort of, and I'll show some examples. Then we get into permissions. So if you want to do push notifications, location, use the camera, the way you set those up and prepare to use those is different at its core. And then I like to call out the ease of end-to-end testing because I'm a testing advocate and I love testing, but testing has been one of my biggest challenges in React Native. Then we have the development or the deployment and the build life cycle and the tools that are required in order to do successful React Native development. Okay. So let's take a look at an example React app. We start with our imports. These should all look really familiar. We've got, components, providers, and our router. And then we have this core app function. And at the top, I threw in a use effect just because I wanted to show, again, the similarities across the platform. So this one's empty. It's not doing anything. And then we get into our JSX. We've got an Apollo provider. It's for GraphQL. In this case, we've got an analytics context provider. But sandwiched there in the middle, we have that app router. That's where the navigation portion of this web application is happening. And then at the very bottom, we have this default export, which is wrapping our app with Sentry for error reporting and some of those analytics. So let's look at a React Native app file. First thing you're going to see, that import of React at the top. And then Oh, my screen's dimming, sorry. So then we have, the similar app function. Again, you see that use effect at the top. And some of the things that I think are really important to start to call out in this JSX blog are the differences. So in this app file, I start with a safe area provider. On mobile applications, think about the notches and all of the differences across devices, where if you had viewable content there, it would make it unusable or unreadable, and so it's really important. Then I have an error handler. Obviously, you can do these things with web as well. At the end of the day, this is a sort of context provider, but in a mobile application, it's really important to gracefully handle app crashes. You don't want it to just close your application if you have a critical error. You want it to somehow notify the user that, oops, something happened, but you're still in the application. And sandwiched again in the middle is an app container. So this is where my navigation is happening. I could have called this many different things, but that's kind of the naming convention that I've been used to. So one of the things that you will not have seen on that file was that export default like we had in the web. So on this one, we've got, this is an index.js file, and we import our app, and then we register that as our root component. Super important. But then at the very bottom, you'll see that export default again, wrapping it in Sentry, a little bit different because it's the native SDK. So our goal here is to kind of look at the differences, again, in how you can take those web development skills and become a mobile developer. So forgive my lack of design skills. I am far from a designer. But what I decided to do was sketch out really quickly, like on Google Slides with some shapes, an idea of a component I could create. So at the root here, we've got a container. It has rounded edges and a border, has a background color. I've got some text elements, and then I've got, this round image, which I'll call an avatar. So let's try and create those in the different platforms. So full disclosure, I don't do very much web development these days. So when I do, CSS is honestly one of the things that I struggle with the most. The JSX and writing that portion of it is pretty simple, but actually getting the styling differences is where I get hung up. But you can see here, this is showing in the web developer tools on the dimensions of an iPhone 12, just to show kind of the mobile responsiveness. But I have this container, which has rounded borders, and I have the border itself with the background color, everything. So one of the things I think is important to call out here is the React Miami portion. I've been able to style that with a cursive font fairly easily. Now you'll see when I get to the mobile side, there's some differences I want to call out. So the code for this, I've got judicious use of divs here to get in that. And again, probably could have done this better, but as I was putting together this slide, it was like, make it work. I have an imported style sheet. With that imported style sheet, I'm giving my class names within my divs, but then also called out on line 7 it is, where I did some inline styling too, because you can do that in mobile, and I wanted to kind of show what that looks like. So here's our CSS. We started with our card. I've got border width, radius, like all the things that you guys should be used to. Here, I decided to go with the display grid, and then call out the different elements to that. And then I've got my left container, and then the rest of it, right? I've got the right container, I've got the title text, and the subtitle text. So as I mentioned, that cursive font, super easy here. All I did was font family, fantasy on one, and font family cursive on another. They are common standard fonts that if you have a web browser, it will display. So here we have an iPhone simulator. I'm using Storybook here to show, you can use Storybook in React Native, but it also makes doing component design so much simpler in a mobile application. unlike web apps where I can say like, go to this URL with query params and all of that embedded, it gets a little bit more challenging in mobile. So when you can do component design isolated, it's really helpful. So you can see again, I've got that same component with my borders, my avatar, etc. It's looking pretty close, but again, that React Miami portion. So part of the reason for that font differences, before I talk about this code, is that if you want a custom font within a mobile application, you actually have to install and include those with it. So I didn't want to get into that with this, but kind of show that difference. So this is our component file. Pretty simple, pretty similar. But instead of divs, you're seeing views. And I'm using the out-of-the-box React Native components to show like what you can get without bringing in any UI component libraries. But you can use other libraries like React Native Paper, or there's all sorts of things similar to Chakra, etc. I've also got some inline styling happening on line 7. But another thing to call out here is I have to have any text that I want to display within a text element. I can't just put text or anything inside a view. If I do that, especially on Android, it will crash because it can't handle those string literals outside of a text element. Okay, so styles here. At the bottom, for simplicity, I included the styles down at the bottom, but this could have been a separate file, again, included similarly. But you can see I'm doing this style sheet.create, and it looks similar. The styles are just objects. I can actually strongly type the way I do my styles. If I say like card is going to be a type of view, then it will know I can't do, say, font family. It will know only to do those on text styles. In this case, I didn't strongly type it. Another thing to note is there's no unit of measure. So when we talk about like border width, radius, it's all based on the DPI of the device. So you have to use either percentages or numbers. So this is where those styles came in. Instead of a class name, I'm calling it style, and it's expecting an object. And here you can see where I embedded inline that object. Okay, so that wasn't too bad, right? Like components on both sides, pretty similar. But one of the biggest differences in how you write these components was the styling. And now I want to talk about a little different direction, navigation. So as I alluded to, navigation does work different. You can jump across what they call stacks, but going back is what really takes a little bit of a different mental model and how you get to where you want to be. So navigation has to start with a navigation container itself. And you can customize these. So I can embed in there, based on, is my app ready? Give it a certain navigation, or have I met a minimum version, or do I want to force them to download something new? Are they authenticated or are they not? So, you can do these things with web as well, but some of the things you're seeing here are like this stack.group, stack.screen. So how you can navigate to these different things and the structure you put them in will depend on how you get there. All right. So some of the elements here, like I was showing, the default nav, it is a const here that I called screens. And I just want it to, by default, be able to show this, like, hey, you might need to update. And under here, the options, the presentation is shown as a full screen modal. So that will determine, like, do I show my bottom tabs? Do I show a header? And you can define all of these within your navigation. So here's some of those screens. You can see Something might be a component that actually embeds another stack, and that's where you get very nested. So here is a tab navigator where before we saw the stack. So the tab navigator is actually like a compilation of the different tabs that I want on the bottom. So in this case, I have like a home tab, and the home tab is being displayed in a certain way. I can define the styles and icons and all of that here. So on this home tab, this is calling another stack called the dashboard. Whoop, sorry, go back one. Sorry. So unless your stack consists of a singular screen, it will most likely be a stack, again, another component. So if you think about banking apps or anything where, I went home or I went to my profile, but then from my profile, I needed to update my address or something like that, those all have to be defined as routes underneath that stack. And you can't just like jump from one to the other in the same regards that you're used to on web. Okay. So I had to throw the goat meme in there. My kids have 2 goats. So I've done a lot of talking about the code specifics, but how do you run a mobile project? We're used to being like npm start, and it brings up a server, and you bring it up in your browser. So, you need different tools. You can have your IDE of choice. I use VS Code, whether I'm, doing web dev, backend dev, mobile dev. That is pretty much where I live. And then, we've got our terminal. I choose to use iTerm. You can use whatever terminal you want. Then we have Node, of course, for anything JavaScript related. And then Watchman. So Watchman is a package that helps detect changes to non-native code. So if you have changes in how your UI is presenting, it will like hot reload. So this is a good thing for your actual development life cycle. However, if you change something that is a native package, you have to recompile. You have to have a Ruby version manager, unfortunately, and you have to have Xcode and CocoaPods for iOS, which a lot of people don't realize, and a lot of engineers use Macs already, so it's not a huge deal. But I have seen where somebody is like, "Oh, I'm going to do React Native from a Windows machine," and I'm like, "Okay, you can, but you can't run an iOS emulator, and you can't actually compile the iOS code because you need Xcode. So unless you're using a virtual machine or some service, then you need Android Studio." Some of these things are big packages, right? They take a lot. I try to leave them closed as much as possible. I do everything that I can from terminal and VS Code. And then we have simulators. So here you can see I have an iOS, iPhone. I can have an iPad. I can have a bajillion different versions of an iPhone with different OS versions, et cetera. And then I have an Android emulator as well. All right. So you've seen some tools, you've seen, some of the environment setup, but what's that look like? How do you, take your current React skills and, get into mobile development? I will take a moment to plug my favorite flavor of React Native, which is Expo. So similar to, Create React App, you have Next.js, and you have different flavors of React web apps. There are a couple of flavors, I'll call them, of React Native. So Expo, I think, kind of gets a bad rap in some ways because people think about Expo Go, which are, it'll get you so far. But if you do bare workflow, you can actually get very close to all that you need. And they give us so many good developer experience tools. The setup and the tools that are available are super helpful. I'll get into a little bit about like EAS, which also helps with building and deploying your app. Okay, so how do you run your app? Like I said, we do npm start with web, you do yarn start or npx expo start if you're doing an expo app. And that will get the server running. It runs Watchman, and then it will bring up an emulator. If you want to specifically run just iOS, you can do Yarn iOS or Android. And I should say NPM. You can use NPM, Yarn, PNPM, whatever you like. So then we get into debugging. So this is a developer menu similar to the dev tools you would find in your browser, but this is actually on a device. And so this is where we can do remote JS debugging in other tools, which I'll get into in a minute, but this is how you would access that. There's another tool called Reactjs, which is something put out by Infinite Red that is supposed to help give you better access to, if you're using Redux or MobX State Tree or something like that for state management. And then there's also Flipper, which is a tool put out by Facebook. I've been told Reactjs is better, that Flipper has some performance issues. I haven't had any problems with it, so I haven't actually tried the other one. That's where you would see your network request, because if you think about your mobile device and trying to debug what is happening there, if you're having any problems, you need a way to actually get into that. Okay, so testing. I told you I love testing. You can do, Jest and React testing library for your unit tests, component tests, snapshot tests, just like you would in a web browser. But end-to-end tests, you kind of have some options. So you have to remember, these are compiled to native code, native Android, native iOS code. So there's a few options, but they can be clunky. They can be hard to set up. It's getting better. I've been doing this for 5 years, and I'm surprised at how far these things have come, but yet how difficult they're still to do, mostly in a CI space. So if you want to automate that testing in a repeatable fashion, it can be pretty heavy. All right, so like React projects, no matter what you're doing, you want to have some sort of validation. So you can have Git workflows that run your tests, run your linters, all of that. And then, went the wrong way. So builds, I think it's important to talk about builds. So you actually have to compile, again, to native code. And that uses Android Studio and Xcode to compile to the actual native applications you would deploy in the stores. And speaking of deployments, one of the crazy things about mobile development is going through like App Store reviews. You don't know, they might one time approve your application feature that's been in there for a while, and then another time they'll say like, sorry, this violates our policies for the store, and you're like, that feature's been in there for months. Okay, cool. There are services that help make this better for doing the deploys, connecting to the app stores. And like I said, Expo Application Services is a really good one, but you can do all sorts of GitHub Actions and all of the CI services. There's several. So we did it. I know that was a ton of information, but I hope that I've inspired at least one person to consider doing some mobile development. I think it's really the future. We all have our phones with us all the time. It's clunky to carry around your laptop. You can give different native experiences with mobile applications, and I would highly welcome any conversation about it if you want to talk to me out in the hallway.